Welcome to Breaking Down Bergman. I'm David Friend.
I'm Sonia Strimban.
We're looking at The Silent.
Vad har jag gjort dig?
Du har väl inte gjort något särskilt? Det är bara det att du alltid tjatar om dina principer. Om att allting är betydelsefullt, allting är viktigt. Men det är ju bara prat. Vet du varför då? Det kan jag tala om för dig. Alltihop är bara till för din märkvärdighet. För du kan inte leva utan din märkvärdighet, det är hela sanningen det. Du kan inte uthärda om inte allting är livsviktigt och betydelsefullt och meningsfullt, jag vet inte vad.
Hur vill du att vi ska leva då?
Jag trodde alltid att du hade rätt. Jag försökte vara som du, för jag beundrade dig. Jag begrep ju inte att du tyckte illa om mig.
Det är inte så.
Du tycker illa om mig. Det har du alltid gjort förresten. Men jag har inte förstått det förrän nu.
Nej.
Jo. Och på något sätt som jag inte begriper är du rädd för mig.
Jag är inte rädd, Anna. Jag älskar dig.
Du pratar alltid så mycket om kärlek, du.
Du får inte säga...
Vadå? Vad är det jag inte får säga? Att Ester hatar. För det är dumt påhittat av dumma Anna. Du hatar mig. Precis som du hatar dig själv. Och mig och allt mitt. Du är full av hat.
Det stämmer inte.
Du som är så intelligent. Har tagit så många examina och översatt så många fina böcker. Kan du svara mig på en sak? När far dog så sa du, nu vill jag inte leva längre. Varför lever du egentligen?
This marks the third film in the trilogy of God and Man, also known as the trilogy of faith. And it definitely turned out to be quite an interesting group of three films.
Yeah, I guess one of the things that I kind of struggled with is understanding why exactly it's a trilogy.
Yeah, there wasn't a certain link between the three.
Mm-hmm. It's definitely something that's not obvious, and you have to give it quite a bit of thought in order for that, you know, woven through theme to come to your mind.
Now, I believe I read a couple interviews where Bergman said that, you know, this wasn't a planned trilogy, it sort of developed into one. And I think that explains why there was that struggle between us trying to figure out how these all fit together. But there is a very light theme between them. Whether they're linked or not, there is a real sense of freedom in Bergman's films here. And I think that's because he's coming off of all those hits that we've been discussing. And these three movies gave him the ability to, you know, work his artistry that he's been, you know, trying to do in other films and sometimes reined in by the studios. Here we see it really laid out and almost in an excessive way.
It is definitely quite an artistic film, but I think in The Silence, more so than the other two, he's also being very experimental with the narrative. The storyline is a little bizarre. It's interesting when you pay attention to it, but it's definitely a lot more random than some of the other films that we've seen, even the two in the trilogy, because they have more of a progression of a tale, whereas this one, it just feels almost like a bunch of scenes thrown together in a way.
When we talk about Bergman's freedom, I think it's also worth noting that this is a very sexualized film, and perhaps the most sexual film that we have seen from him. The censors surprisingly passed it at the time because of some political issues that were going on. But the film caused a stir in the art community.
I think this film would cause a stir in any community. It's
even today,
fairly scandalous.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, the one scene in the theater where one of the two female characters goes into the theater to watch a film, and then there's a couple to her side that is just engaging in a sexual act very blatantly, and it comes up so randomly. You're completely not expecting it as a viewer, and and it's just shocking. You know, it's completely shocking. Not only the fact that there's nudity, okay, so that's surprising enough, but just the graphic elements of their intercourse is very surprising. So that for me really begs the question: why did he use so many sexual scenes? Not only sexual, but aggressively sexual, overtly sexual, and new types of sex scenes that we haven't seen from Bergman before, but maybe even in cinema, like for example, masturbation, female masturbation. You know, it was all so surprising. And for me, when Bergman does things like that, it always triggers a thought in my mind to say, this means more than what he's showing. And so, you know, I was questioning what the film is really about and what is he choosing to tell us through these scenes. What I really came to was that sex was a substitute for, as cliche as this might sound, intimacy, but not just intimacy of the physical kind, but the intimacy that happens in any relationship where people can really understand each other and relate to each other and have a sense of empathy and care. Here, that was completely absent from the film. There's actually a lot of cruelty in the film, just simply from miscommunication or misunderstanding or this inability to empathize with one another between the characters.
And while Bergman tries to use sex as sort of a base substitute for communication, The Silence is really about the lack of communication between people, whether you're relatives or strangers. Mm-hmm. Most of this film is about individuals who can't seem to connect with others in the way that they would like to.
The inability also makes it difficult for the audience to connect and understand them, and therefore connect with what Bergman is trying to say to us, I think. The two women in the film, Esther and Anna, there's this air of mystery around them and what their real motivation is for the way that they are. There's an implication that they might be sisters or somehow related to each other, but then there's also this kind of ambiguity about whether they could have had some kind of lesbian relationship prior, especially Esther, who seems to be very attracted to Anna, and Anna seems to use that to wound her and to hurt her by picking up affairs with random men. One thing that I found was, despite the fact that people were so disconnected, they were desperately yearning to be loved, to be nurtured, to be cared for in some way. And we see that through the way that they kind of awkwardly reach out to each other and try to build dialogue. But instead of being communicative and caring, it ends up being hostile and angry. And in the film, this is highlighted in different scenarios. So for example, Esther, in a film that is about miscommunication, she's actually a linguist, and yet she can't communicate. She can't connect with the one person that she actually truly loves, which is Anna.
And then there's Johan, the child, who has been traveling with these two women, yet is entirely disconnected from them and seemingly from reality. He spends a lot of the film wandering the halls of the hotel, sort of spying on others, maybe having a brief interaction with them, but not with words. What Bergman seems to be saying is that no matter if you're Johan, that child, or you're the butler who works in the hotel that Johan crosses paths with, or the bartender who has the random sexual encounter, it doesn't matter. Everyone is disconnected, and everyone is sort of struggling to be connected, but it's this futile effort constantly.
It's interesting, that disconnection, because Bergman really makes it poignant in the way that there's multiple layers of miscommunication. For one thing, Anna and Esther and Johan, the child, are traveling. So the location of the film is a foreign country. We don't know exactly where they are, but we know that Anna and Esther can't speak the language of the people that they're surrounded by. So that's one layer of miscommunication. Also, they're not aware of the surroundings, so they don't know how to interact with people. So it's a lot more difficult to connect, and everyone is a stranger to them except the two of them. So theoretically, that would kind of bring them closer together, but actually the distance between them is so charged that there's almost this sense of hatred. There's like a yearning for them to understand each other, but at the same time, that distance is so insurmountable that it brings them to a total frustration with each other and this loathing that they have for each other. It's very bizarre. Esther, who's the main character, played by Ingrid Thulin, is very ill in the film, but she seems to neglect herself and continue smoking and drinking. And Anna also has these fatalistic tendencies where she goes randomly out into the city and picks up strange men and takes them home and has, very untowardly sexual episodes with them. So it's very bizarre because the more alone the characters seem to be, the harder they're trying to connect with someone, but they're going about it in all the wrong ways. I think the silence here has a double meaning. It's not only the space and the distance and silence that exists between people that can't relate to each other. It's also the absence of God, the total silence of God. And I think that's kind of the reference back to the other films, where throughout the trilogy, we really start to see God fade more and more and more from each film. Particularly the link back to Winter Light, where everyone is trying to kind of resurrect God in their church community, to hear God, to have God direct them, and God is somehow absent. Not even the priest can, connect with God anymore. Here there's a complete absence and a total silence.
There's a war going on outside the windows of this hotel. There's a child, watching the tanks drive by and just disappear off into the distance. And it's this completely disconnected state where no one has that reason to exist. Mm-hmm. And Bergman seems to be saying in some ways that without that reason, we don't have a way to unite as people. There are several little hints that Bergman lays out through the film. Within each of the characters, we have the chain smoker, the boozer, the nymphomaniac. All of these things you would probably connect with those who do not have God in their life, or someone who might have God in their life and is really struggling to find where they fit. Perhaps Bergman is using those stereotypes to portray his message about religion in this film. The film is, in some ways, a silent film for much of the time. Mm-hmm. And we have talked about for a couple Bergman films, most recently The Virgin Spring, his use of sound effect to create the world and create a mood. And I think you see that accentuated in the silence. You hear everything from the bangles on a woman's wrist to the boy looking out the window and the tank motor just whirring as it goes by. Everything in this movie that has to do with sound is prominent.
Yeah, it's very jarring. To a point, I almost started to rattle me, through the film, because it just interrupts. It interrupts the things that you want to try to connect with in the film, to try and make meaning, and you're just bombarded by all these noises that should be background noises.
The camera angles in this film are also in very strange places. He puts the camera up on the ceiling in certain shots. There's all these places that the camera has never been before in a Bergman film, and I think for a lot of viewers it's never really been in any film. He really approaches this world that exists with a whole different style than we've seen previously.
I know that you think it's a strength, and I won't disagree with you in terms of technicality, but in terms of a viewer experience, I think it just left me more disoriented with the entire film as a whole.
I think that begs the question of whether this experiment that Bergman did was really successful. Do you think this is essential Bergman?
No, I don't. I mean, for the most part, I can't say that I thoroughly enjoyed the film. I think he definitely tried to push the envelope here, which is commendable. But on the other hand, I walk away from the movie wondering, what was I supposed to have learned? What was he trying to communicate to me? And the reason that I know I should have learned something is because we have this child character in the movie who, much like the audience themselves, is trying to make sense of his surroundings and trying to learn how to become an adult, how to interact in real life, and how to make meaning from life and significance. And I don't feel like Johan learns anything. I think he's as confused and frightened and hurt at the end of the movie as he was at the beginning. He's been abandoned through the film, and I feel that as an audience, we've been abandoned by Bergman.
But isn't that Bergman films?
No.
Isn't the fact that he doesn't have an answer
Not at all.
Why not?
Well, I'm not saying an answer, but there's always a lesson.
I guess, but every Bergman film leaves it open at the end, and life does not tie itself up as in a bow, and we've discussed that many times.
I don't disagree with you, but I still feel that Bergman gives us enough that we can walk away feeling like we've had some kind of experience with him and have learned something, or at least have processed something. In this film, like I said at the beginning, I feel like there's a whole bunch of random stuff that he crammed in, added a touch of experimental sound and noise stuff, and it's a wrap.
Do you really think that's how he makes his film, Sonia? Just throw it in a basket and shake it up and release it into the world.
Well, maybe with this one.
I don't know. I have to disagree with you. I don't think it's essential Bergman, but I do think it was really interesting, and it is a bit of a challenge to watch this film, quite like Winter Light, and I think that's one of the reasons that you hated Winter Light.
I don't hate
Okay, you didn't like Winter Light. Is that it was that type of movie where everything wasn't arranged as we had expected it to be, because we've known how Bergman's rhythms have started to work. And the silence is, again, a change in rhythm, and we don't exactly know how to process that yet. I'm wondering if when we come back at the end of this decade, we might think differently about Winter Light and the silence.
I hope so. I think what I'm mostly looking forward to in the next several films in the next decade is that, especially with the end of this trilogy, Bergman really seems to be signaling to us that he might be ready to kind of move ahead of this God question.
Yeah, I think that is interesting. Whether we are really going to see God continue to be one of his struggles. I think it will be. I think it'll step into the background. That is my guess. But again, we shouldn't be guessing.
Remains to be seen.
And that brings us to the end of another episode of Breaking Down Bergman. Join us next time when we will be looking at All These Women.
And don't forget to let us know what you thought of this movie and all of Bergman's other efforts. You can comment either on YouTube or like us on Facebook as well.
And we will see you next time on Breaking Down Bergman.